A man rescues a dog trapped in a cage, thinking it's just a lost, broken animal. But the moment he sees the collar, everything starts to feel wrong. The dog doesn't bark. He stares, scratches at one door, and won't stop. Then one night, the man hears a voice he thought he'd never hear again. What did this dog bring into his life? And why does it feel like it's only the beginning? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Frank Delaney opened his eyes to darkness. The alarm clock's red numbers glared at him. 5:30 a.m. Same as every morning. He didn't need the alarm anymore. His body knew the routine. 5 years of the same empty waking. He swung his feet to the cold floor and sat hunched on the edge of the bed. Dirty clothes littered the floor. Unwashed dishes crowded the nightstand. The blinds stayed permanently half closed, letting in just enough gray light to navigate the mess. Today was different, though. Today marked 5 years. After a shower that barely registered in his mind, Frank shuffled down the hallway. He paused at the door with the faded butterfly stickers. His hand trembled slightly as it hovered over the doorknob. With a deep breath, he pushed it open. Everything remained exactly as it had been. The pink bedspread, the stuffed animals arranged in a neat row, the soccer trophies. A fine layer of dust covered it all like a blanket of grief. "Morning, Lizzie," he whispered, his voice cracking from disuse. Frank stood in the doorway, his face a mask. Inside, his heart twisted with familiar pain, but his eyes remained dry. He'd cried himself empty years ago. At the auto shop, Frank worked silently on Mrs. Henderson's ancient Buick. "You're a miracle worker, Frank," she said, handing him payment. "Don't know what I'd do without you." "Just doing my job," he muttered, not meeting her eyes. "My son's having a barbecue this weekend. You should come. Do you good to—" "Can't. Busy." Frank cut her off, sliding beneath the car to escape further conversation. By noon, his stomach forced him into town. At Rosie's Cafe, he slid onto his usual corner stool. "The usual, Frank?" Rosie asked, already pouring coffee. He nodded. "Beautiful day out there," she continued, placing a sandwich before him. "Some of us are having a little potluck at the park later. Nothing fancy. You'd be welcome to—" "Thanks. Not interested." His words came out sharper than intended. Rosie's smile faltered, but quickly recovered. "Offer stands." At sunset, Frank drove his old pickup to the forest edge. These evening drives were his only peace, just him and the winding dirt roads beneath towering pines. No people, no questions, no pitying looks. He rolled down the windows, letting the cool evening air rush in. The forest stretched around him, silent except for the crunch of tires on gravel. Then he heard it. Barking. Frantic and desperate, echoing between the trees. Frank slowed the truck. The barking came again, urgent, panicked. He frowned. Nobody came out here. That's why he chose this place. The barking grew more insistent, pulling him from his thoughts. Frank cut the engine. The barking stopped, then started again, more desperate this time. Something about the sound tugged at him like a forgotten memory. "Damn it," he muttered, grabbing his flashlight from the glove compartment. He stepped out of the truck, boots crunching on fallen pine needles. The forest was getting dark fast. The barking guided him deeper between the trees, away from the road. Frank swept his flashlight across the underbrush. The beam caught something metallic about 50 yards in. He pushed through low-hanging branches and thorny bushes that scratched at his arms. "Hello?" he called, immediately feeling foolish. Who would answer? The barking turned to whining, pitiful and weak. Frank's light finally found it. A rusted metal cage, partially hidden beneath a pile of branches and leaves. Inside was a German shepherd, so thin its ribs showed clearly through its matted fur. The dog's eyes reflected the flashlight beam, wide with fear or hope. Frank couldn't tell which. Who would? He started, anger rising unexpectedly in his chest. The cage had been deliberately hidden, the dog left to die slowly. The shepherd whined again, pawing weakly at the cage door. A heavy padlock kept it shut. Frank hesitated. He didn't need complications. He didn't need responsibility. He could call animal control tomorrow. The dog's eyes stayed fixed on him. Fine, Frank sighed, grabbing a rock. It took several hard strikes before the rusted lock broke open. The dog didn't bolt. It simply watched Frank with wary eyes, too weak to move quickly. As Frank reached cautiously toward the collar, the dog lowered its head, allowing him to touch it. A metal tag hung from the worn leather collar. Frank turned it over in his palm and read the engraving. "I'm sorry." "Sorry for what?" Frank whispered, a chill running through him. The dog made no move to leave the cage. "Come on," Frank said gruffly. "I'm not carrying you." After several gentle tugs on the collar, the German shepherd finally limped out. Frank could feel every bone as he helped the dog stand. Back at the truck, Frank spread his old work jacket across the passenger seat. The dog needed coaxing to climb in, its legs trembling with the effort. Frank slid behind the wheel and glanced at his unexpected passenger. The dog sat perfectly still, watching him with those intelligent eyes. "Don't get used to this," Frank told it, starting the engine. "It's just for tonight." They drove in silence, the dog barely moving except for the shallow rise and fall of its bony chest. Frank pulled into his driveway, the headlights briefly illuminating the peeling paint of his garage door. He glanced at the dog, who hadn't moved the entire drive. "Come on," he said, opening the passenger door. The German shepherd didn't budge. "Look, I can't sit here all night." With a sigh, Frank gently scooped up the dog, surprised by how little it weighed. The animal trembled against his chest, but didn't struggle. In the garage, Frank laid out an old blanket in the corner. He placed the dog down carefully, watching as it curled into a tight ball. "Water," Frank muttered to himself. "You need water." He found an old mixing bowl, filled it at the sink, and set it down. The dog lifted its head but didn't drink. "I don't have dog food," Frank said, feeling oddly self-conscious talking to an animal. He rummaged through his refrigerator and found leftover chicken. "This'll have to do." The dog sniffed the meat but didn't eat. "Suit yourself," Frank said, turning to leave. At the door, he hesitated. The night was cold. "Fine," he grumbled, adjusting the garage's space heater to point toward the blanket. "But you're staying out here." The bell above the door jingled as Frank entered Maplewood Supply the next morning. He grabbed a shopping basket and headed straight for the pet section, something he hadn't done in years. "Can I help you find anything?" asked the clerk. "Dog food," Frank replied curtly. He selected a bag, then added antiseptic spray and cotton pads to his basket. As he reached for a brush, a woman's voice came from behind him. "That's better for long-haired breeds," she said. "For a German shepherd, you might want this one." Frank turned to see a woman with curly hair and a rescue shelter logo on her jacket. "I'm Lena Rivera," she said, extending her hand. "I volunteer at the animal shelter. New dog?" "Just found one," Frank said, ignoring her hand. "Temporary situation." Lena's smile didn't falter. "Well, if you need any help—" "I don't," Frank interrupted, taking the brush she suggested and walking toward the register. Back home, Frank opened the garage door to find the dog standing alert, the water bowl empty and the chicken gone. "At least you're eating," he said, setting down the new supplies. As Frank filled a bowl with dog food, he heard scratching. The German shepherd was pawing frantically at the door that led to his backyard shed. "Hey, stop that!" Frank snapped. The dog continued, its claws making desperate sounds against the wood. "I said stop!" Frank yelled, his voice cracking. Ah! The German Shepherd froze, turning to look at Frank with those penetrating eyes. Something in that gaze, intelligent, knowing, made Frank's heart pound. That's private," Frank whispered, his throat suddenly tight. The dog tilted its head, as if understanding every word, then slowly walked back to the blanket and lay down, eyes never leaving Frank's face. Frank sat in his worn armchair, staring blankly at the television. The volume was low, just background noise to fill the empty house. But his mind wasn't on the flickering screen. It kept drifting back to the dog in his garage and those eyes, intelligent, almost accusing. The phone rang, startling him. Frank rarely got calls. "Hello?" he answered gruffly. "Frank?" "It's Jim Peterson from down the road." The voice sounded concerned. "Listen, my sister-in-law's dog went missing a couple days ago. Brown lab mix answers to Buddy. You haven't seen anything, have you?" Frank thought of the German Shepherd in his garage. Number not a lab. Sorry. "Well, if you spot anything, give me a call, would you?" "Sure thing," Frank said, hanging up quickly. He walked to the window that faced the garage. The scratching had stopped, but Frank couldn't shake the feeling that something was pulling him toward the shed. Something he'd locked away years ago, both literally and in his heart. A memory surfaced, unbidden. His daughter, maybe 6 years old, playing in the backyard. Her blonde hair catching sunlight as she twirled, laughing. "Daddy, watch me," she had called, her voice clear as a bell even now, 5 years after her death. Frank closed his eyes, the pain fresh and raw. When he opened them again, he could almost see her there, running across the lawn toward the shed where he used to work on special projects, where they used to work together. The dog had been scratching at that exact door. "It's nothing," Frank muttered to himself. "Just a stray." But as night fell and Frank finally drifted to sleep in his chair, his dreams carried him deeper into the past. His daughter stood in the moonlight, wearing the yellow dress she'd loved so much. She wasn't laughing now, but looking at him with solemn eyes. "He knows, Daddy," she whispered, pointing toward the shed. "He knows what happened." Frank tried to reach for her, but she was always just beyond his fingertips. "Who knows?" Frank called out in his dream. "What does he know?" His daughter simply smiled, a sad, knowing smile that didn't belong on a child's face. "The dog, Daddy. Luca knows." Frank jerked awake, heart pounding. He had never named the dog. He hadn't even checked for a name tag. How did he know the dog's name was Luca? Lena Rivera pulled her forest green SUV to the side of the dirt road. She'd received 3 calls this week about abandoned dogs in this area. The first had been rescued, a terrier mix now recovering at the shelter. The second was never found. And now there were reports of barking near the Eastern Trail. She grabbed her backpack filled with rescue supplies and headed into the woods. Fallen leaves crunched beneath her boots as she followed the narrow path, eyes scanning for any signs of distress. "Hello," she called out periodically. "Anyone out here?" After 20 minutes of searching, Lena spotted something unnatural among the undergrowth, the glint of rusted metal. Her heart sank as she pushed aside branches to reveal another cage, similar to ones she'd found before. This one was empty, but dark stains marked the bottom. "Not again," she whispered, pulling out her phone to document the evidence. As she photographed the cage, memories flooded back, memories she tried to keep buried. 3 years ago, she'd been working with local police to bust an illegal dogfighting ring. They'd been so close, but someone had tipped off the organizers. By the time they arrived, most of the dogs were gone, except one, a German Shepherd, badly injured but alive. Lena had reached for him, their eyes meeting for just a moment before her supervisor pulled her back. "Too dangerous," he'd said. "Animal control is coming." But when they returned with proper equipment, the dog was gone. Lena never forgave herself for not acting faster. That evening, back at her small apartment, Lena uploaded the photos to her animal rescue page. "Urgent. More evidence of dog abandonment in Westridge Forest," she typed. "Please report any suspicious activity. If you've seen any dogs in distress, contact me immediately." She hit post and switched on the local news for background noise while she made dinner. At Frank's house, Luca lay curled on an old blanket in the corner of the living room. Frank had reluctantly allowed him inside after the temperature dropped. The TV murmured softly, the evening news covering local stories. When Lena's face appeared on screen during a segment about animal abandonment, Luca's head shot up. His ears perked forward, and without warning, he lunged toward the television, barking frantically. Frank dropped his coffee mug, the ceramic shattering on the floor. "What the hell?" Luca continued barking, his eyes fixed on Lena's image, paws pressing against the screen as if trying to reach her. "You know her?" Frank asked, bewildered by the dog's deliberate reaction. Luca turned to Frank, their eyes meeting with an intensity that made Frank step back. This wasn't random animal behavior. The dog was trying to tell him something. The next morning, Frank loaded Luca into his pickup truck. The dog seemed hesitant, pressing his body against the passenger door as Frank drove into town. Maybe he was afraid of being abandoned again. "Just getting you checked out," Frank mumbled, surprising himself by trying to reassure the animal. The local veterinary clinic was a small building with faded blue trim. Dr. Marquez, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and salt and pepper hair, greeted them in the examination room. "Let's see what we have here," she said, running her hands gently over Luca's body. The dog trembled, but didn't resist. Some old scars, slight malnutrition, but otherwise healthy. "You said you found him in the woods?" Frank nodded. "In a cage. Thought maybe he belongs to someone." "We can check for a microchip." Dr. Marquez ran the scanner over Luca's shoulder blades and neck. The device beeped, then flickered off. She frowned, tapping it against her palm. "That's strange. It detected something, but then malfunctioned." She tried twice more with the same result. "Might be an older model chip," she explained, writing something on a card. "My colleague in Cedar Falls has equipment for the outdated ones. He might be able to help." Frank took the card, tucking it into his wallet. "Thanks." On the drive home, Frank stopped at the general store for dog food. As he walked back to his truck, a community bulletin board caught his eye. Among concert flyers and yard sale notices was a yellowed newspaper clipping, its edges curling with age. The headline made him freeze. "Looking for the father of my daughter, Amy Delgado." Frank's fingers trembled as he unpinned it. The photo showed a young woman with dark hair and determined eyes holding a baby. The date on the clipping was 8 years ago. Amy, a name he'd tried so hard to forget. He folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his pocket, heart pounding as he drove home in silence. Back at the house, Luca immediately ran to the shed door, scratching frantically at the weathered wood. Frank had avoided this small building for 5 years, keeping it locked tight like the memories inside. "Stop that," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Luca whined, pawing more urgently. With a deep breath, Frank retrieved the key from inside the house. The lock was stiff from disuse, but eventually turned. The door creaked open, releasing the musty smell of forgotten things. Frank stepped inside, Luca brushing past his legs. Dust motes danced in the beams of light filtering through the dirty windows. Cardboard boxes lined the walls, each containing pieces of a life Frank had tried to erase. Luca moved purposefully to a corner, sniffing at a plastic storage bin. Frank reluctantly opened it, revealing his daughter's toys. On top lay a worn stuffed elephant with one ear missing. Luca gently took the elephant in his mouth, placed it carefully on the floor, then lay down beside it, his head resting protectively next to the toy. Frank sank to his knees, staring at the dog and the elephant in disbelief. Frank sat in his truck, parked at the edge of town where cell reception was strongest. The yellowed newspaper clipping trembled in his weathered hands. Amy Delgado's eyes stared back at him from the faded photo, the baby in her arms, just a tiny bundle. His throat tightened as he pulled out his phone. The number printed at the bottom of the clipping had faded, but was still readable. Frank punched in the digits slowly, each number feeling heavier than the last. He held his breath as the phone rang. "We're sorry. The number you have dialed has been disconnected or is no longer in service." Frank closed his eyes, letting out a shaky breath. What had he expected after all these years? He folded the clipping carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. At the animal shelter across town, Lena Rivera frowned at her computer screen. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she clicked through case files of recently abandoned dogs. "That's the third one this month," she muttered, adding a red flag to Luca's file. Her coworker, Marco, leaned over her shoulder. "What's up?" "These scars." Lena pointed to photos of different dogs. "See the pattern? All found within 20 miles of each other, all with these same marks on their muzzles and legs." Marco squinted. "Fighting dogs. That's what I'm thinking. And this new one, the German Shepherd that Frank Delaney found, fits the profile." She tapped her pen against the desk. "I need to follow up on this." The evening shadows stretched across Frank's living room as he sat on the floor beside Luca. The dog lay quietly, his nose touching the worn stuffed elephant from the shed. Frank had placed a framed photo of his daughter on the coffee table, Lily at 7, laughing on a swing set. "Who were you to her?" Frank asked softly, surprising himself with the question. Luca's ears perked up. The dog lifted his head, dark eyes fixed on Frank, then turned toward the photo on the table. A small whine escaped his throat as he looked back and forth between Frank and the picture. Frank felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't just imagination. The dog was responding directly to his question, to the photo. "Did you know her somehow?" Frank whispered, his voice cracking. Luca stood, gently picked up the stuffed elephant in his mouth, and carried it to the photo. He placed it carefully beside the frame, then sat back, watching Frank with those knowing eyes. Frank reached out a trembling hand to touch the dog's head. For the first time in years, tears welled in his eyes. Lena Rivera pushed open the door to Oak Ridge Veterinary Clinic, the bell jingling cheerfully above her head. Dr. Peterson looked up from his desk, recognition crossing his face. "You're the shelter volunteer, right? What brings you by today?" Lena approached the counter. "I'm following up on a German Shepherd that Frank Delaney brought in last week. I heard you had trouble with his microchip." "Ah, yes," Dr. Peterson nodded. "Strange case. The scanner kept giving error readings. Older chip model, maybe." "That's exactly why I'm here," Lena said, pulling out her ID badge. "Our shelter has an older scanner that might work. Would it be possible to access his records? I just need the chip information." The vet hesitated, then shrugged. "Frank didn't officially register the dog, so I don't see why not. Might help solve the mystery." He pulled up Luca's file and printed a copy of the initial exam, including the partial microchip data they'd managed to retrieve. "Thanks," Lena said, carefully folding the paper. "This could help us figure out where he came from." Frank's mailbox rarely held anything but bills and junk mail. He flipped through the stack absently until a government envelope caught his eye. The return address read, Department of Family Services. His heart quickened as he tore it open right there by the mailbox. "Dear Mr. Delaney," it began, "we regret to inform you that Amy Delgado has passed away due to complications from pneumonia. Our records indicate you as a person of interest regarding her minor child, Ella Delgado, age 10, currently in temporary foster placement." Frank's hands trembled so badly the letter crinkled. Amy was dead. And there was a child, a daughter, his granddaughter. He read the letter 3 times, struggling to process each word. The social worker's contact information was printed at the bottom, along with office hours. Without thinking, Frank climbed into his truck. Luca, who had been waiting patiently in the passenger seat, watched him with curious eyes. "I might have a granddaughter," Frank whispered, his voice breaking. The family services waiting room smelled of lemon cleaner and old coffee. Frank sat rigid in an uncomfortable plastic chair, the letter clutched in his hand. Children's drawings decorated the walls, stick figures and houses with smiling suns overhead. Frank stared at them, wondering if any might be Ella's. Ella Delgado. The name echoed in his mind. Amy's daughter. His granddaughter. What right did he have to be here? He'd never even known Amy was pregnant, had never answered her attempts to contact him. And now she was gone, and her daughter, his blood, was alone in the system. "Mr. Delaney?" A woman with a clipboard appeared in the doorway. "I'm Ms. Winters. I understand you received our letter?" Frank stood awkwardly, his mouth dry. "Yes, about Ella Delgado. Please come with me." Frank followed, his heart pounding. He had no idea what he would say, or if he even deserved to be part of this child's life. But something stronger than fear pushed him forward, a chance to make right what had gone so terribly wrong. Lena's fingers flew over the keyboard at the shelter's back office. The ancient scanner hummed loudly as it processed Luca's microchip information. Most people had upgraded to newer systems years ago, but Lena had insisted on keeping this old model around. Sometimes, like today, the older technology proved useful. "Come on," she whispered, tapping her fingers impatiently on the desk. The screen flickered, then displayed a green confirmation box. Lena leaned forward, squinting at the information. "Oh my God," she breathed. The registration information was clear. Luca, German Shepherd, male. Owner, Amy Delgado. The date of registration was exactly 8 years ago. There was even an address, an apartment complex across town that Lena recognized. She quickly printed the record, grabbed her keys, and headed for her car. This couldn't wait. At Frank's house, Luca paced restlessly in front of the window. His ears perked up suddenly, and he turned toward the front door. A low whine built in his throat before erupting into sharp, urgent barks. Frank looked up from the kitchen table, where he'd been staring at the social services letter for the past hour. "What is it, boy?" Luca raced to the door, scratching frantically at the wood, his nails making sharp clicking sounds. All right, Frank muttered, pushing himself up from the chair. The dog had never acted this way before. He pulled the door open just as a car screeched to a halt in his driveway. Lena Rivera jumped out, clutching a piece of paper in her hand. Her face was flushed with excitement. "Frank, I need to talk to you," she called, hurrying up the walkway. Luca stood at Frank's side, tail wagging with such force his whole body shook. "What's going on?" Frank asked, his voice guarded. Lena held out the paper, slightly breathless. "I scanned Luca's microchip with our old equipment. Frank, he belonged to Amy Delgado. He was registered to her 8 years ago." Frank stared at the paper, the world seeming to tilt beneath his feet. His eyes traced over Amy's name again and again. He reached out to steady himself against the doorframe. "Amy," he whispered, the name feeling strange on his lips after so many years. "She was looking for me." Luca pressed against Frank's leg, looking up at him with knowing eyes. "This dog," Frank continued, his voice barely audible, "he belonged to her. To Amy." Lena nodded. "He must have found his way to you somehow." Frank knelt down slowly, placing a trembling hand on Luca's head. The dog who had appeared so mysteriously in the woods, who had scratched at his shed, who had stared at his daughter's picture. He had been Amy's companion all along. "He's the connection," Frank said, realization dawning. "Between me and Ella," Lena finished softly. The next morning, Frank sat rigid in a plastic chair at the family services office, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, making the already sterile room feel even colder. "I'm sorry, Mr. Delaney," the caseworker said, sliding a form across her desk. "Without proof of paternity or legal guardianship, I can't give you any information about Ella Delgado." Frank leaned forward. "But I think I'm her grandfather. Her mother was looking for me." "Suspicions aren't enough," she replied, her voice softening slightly. "We need documentation." 3 days later, Frank was back, clutching a faded photograph of himself and Amy from years ago. The caseworker shook her head. "DNA testing," she suggested. "It's the only way to establish legal connection." On his 5th visit in 2 weeks, Frank brought the newspaper clipping. The caseworker sighed. "Mr. Delaney, I understand your frustration, but these rules protect children. Start the DNA process and we can talk again." Meanwhile, Lena spent her lunch breaks with Luca at Frank's house. Today, she watched as the dog's ears perked up at the sound of children playing outside. "He's special," she told Frank, who was researching Amy's last known address on his laptop. "Watch how he responds." She played a recording of a child crying on her phone. Immediately, Luca stood at attention, whining softly and nudging her hand. "I think he was trained as an emotional support dog," Lena explained. "The way he responds to distress isn't typical. He was specifically chosen to help someone." Frank looked up from his computer. "Ella," he said quietly. "He was for Ella." The apartment building was faded red brick, with rusted fire escapes zigzagging down its face. Frank knocked on the superintendent's door, heart pounding. A heavy-set man with gray stubble answered. "Yeah?" "I'm looking for information about a former tenant, Amy Delgado." The man's eyes narrowed, then softened with recognition. "Amy? Sweet girl. Shame what happened." "You knew her?" "Sure. Lived in 3B for years with her little girl and that dog." He gestured toward Luca, who sat patiently beside Frank. "That him?" Frank nodded. "She mentioned to Frank sometimes. Said she was trying to find him for her daughter's sake." The superintendent scratched his chin. "Before she got sick, she put some stuff in storage. Said it was important. A box labeled Ella's dad. Never came back for it." Frank's breath caught. "Do you know where this storage unit is?" "Down on Maple Street. Unit 17, I think. She paid a year in advance." The man shook his head sadly. "Like she knew she might not make it back." Frank thanked him and turned to leave, his mind racing. Amy had been preparing to connect him with Ella. She'd saved things specifically for this moment, a moment she wouldn't live to see. Luca pressed against his leg as if urging him forward toward the next piece of the puzzle. The storage facility smelled of dust and forgotten things. Frank followed the numbered units until he found 17, his heart thumping against his ribs. The padlock was rusted, but intact. He tried the key the superintendent had given him, and after some jiggling, it clicked open. The metal door groaned as he lifted it, Inside sat several cardboard boxes, neatly labeled in flowing handwriting. One in particular caught his eye. Ella's dad, written in bold black marker. Frank knelt beside it, hands trembling slightly as he opened the flaps. On top lay a stack of children's drawings, stick figures holding hands, a house with a smoking chimney, and a large dog with a smiling face. Each was signed in crooked letters. E-L-L-A. "She knew about me," Frank whispered, his throat tight. Beneath the drawings were envelopes addressed to Frank Delaney, never stamped or sent. He opened one, unfolding the paper inside. "Frank," it began, "Ella asked about her father again today. I should have told you years ago. After what happened with your daughter, I was afraid to bring more pain into your life. But Ella deserves to know you, and maybe you both need each other." Frank's vision blurred. He blinked hard and reached deeper into the box. His fingers found a photograph. A baby girl with dark curls sleeping peacefully against Luca's side. The dog's protective posture was unmistakable, even then. "What are you doing here?" A sharp voice cut through the silence. Frank turned to see a uniformed police officer blocking the doorway, hand resting on his belt. "This unit is part of a sealed estate," the officer said, eyes narrowed. "I'm Officer Brent Tolliver. Care to explain why you're rummaging through it?" Frank stood slowly. "Amy Delgado was looking for me. I think I'm her daughter's father." At Amy's name, Tolliver's expression changed. A flash of something like fear crossed his face before he composed himself. "You knew Amy?" Tolliver asked, his tone suddenly careful. "Years ago. I just found out she passed away." Tolliver stepped back, nodding stiffly. "Right. Well, make sure you get proper clearance next time. Estate matters are complicated." He turned to leave, then paused. "Sorry for your loss." Later that evening, Frank spread the letters and drawings across his kitchen table. Luca sat nearby, watching intently. "Tolliver seemed pretty interested in Amy's stuff," Frank told Lena over the phone. "Got nervous when I mentioned her name." "Brent Tolliver?" Lena's voice sharpened. "Frank, be careful around him. He was suspended last year during an investigation into illegal dogfighting. There wasn't enough evidence to charge him, but everyone at the shelter knows he was involved somehow." Frank glanced at Luca, remembering the cage where he'd found him. "You think there's a connection?" "I don't know," Lena admitted. "But it's strange he's hanging around Amy's storage unit. What would a cop with a history of animal abuse want with her belongings?" Frank looked again at the photo of Luca with baby Ella. "Maybe it's not about Amy at all," he said quietly. "Maybe it's about Luca." Frank clutched the worn cardboard box to his chest as he walked into the family services office. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, making the sterile waiting room feel even colder. His palms were sweaty against the box that held the fragments of a life he never knew existed. "Mr. Delaney," a woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair approached. "I'm Marcia Winters, taking over Ella's case." Frank nodded, unable to find words. He followed her to a small office and carefully placed the box on her desk. "These are things I found in Amy Delgado's storage unit," he explained, his voice rough. "Letters she wrote to me but never sent. Drawings Ella made of," his voice caught, "of her dad." Marcia gently sorted through the items, pausing at a child's drawing of 3 stick figures, a tall man, a woman with long hair, and a small girl between them, all holding hands. "Ella's family" was written in wobbly letters at the top. "There's a photo, too," Frank said, pointing to the picture of baby Ella with Luca. "That's the same dog I found abandoned in the woods. Amy's dog." Marcia studied everything carefully, then looked up at Frank with new understanding in her eyes. "This is compelling, Mr. Delaney. I'll initiate a background check today and expedite the DNA test. If everything checks out, we can arrange a supervised visit with Ella. Frank's heart skipped. How soon? Give me a week, she promised. This little girl has been through enough shuffling in the system. If you're who these materials suggest you are, she deserves to know. That night, Frank sat on the back porch steps, the sky above scattered with stars. Luca lay beside him, alert and watchful. The dog's presence had become a strange comfort in the lonely house. Frank took a deep breath and looked up at the brightest star. Sarah, he whispered, addressing his daughter for the first time in years. I don't know if you can hear me. I've been so angry for so long. Tears welled in his eyes. If I'd known about Amy, about Ella, I would have tried. I would have been there. His voice broke. Luca shifted, placing his head gently on Frank's knee. The warm weight anchored Frank as tears flowed freely down his face. I failed you, Frank continued. I don't want to fail Ella, too. Across town, Lena's phone rang as she sorted through shelter paperwork. The caller ID showed unknown number. Hello? Stop asking questions about the fighting rings, a distorted voice warned. Mind your own business if you know what's good for you. The line went dead. Lena's hand trembled as she set down the phone. She glanced at Luca, who had insisted on following her home that evening. He was curled up on her living room rug, watching her with those knowing eyes. She knelt beside him, running her fingers through his thick fur. Someone's scared we're getting close, she whispered. Luca licked her hand as if in agreement. Lena straightened her shoulders. No, she wouldn't back down. Not when dogs like Luca were still suffering. Not when there were connections she was just beginning to unravel. Lena's fingers trembled as she inserted her key into the shelter's back entrance. Something felt wrong, even before the door swung open. The stillness was unnatural for a building that usually hummed with animal sounds. Hello? She called, flipping on the light switch. Her heart dropped. The shelter office had been ransacked. Filing cabinets hung open with papers strewn across the floor. Computer monitors lay shattered on desks. The security camera that normally blinked red in the corner dangled by a wire, its lens smashed. No, 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 Lena whispered, stepping carefully through the chaos. She rushed to her desk, praying that her fears wouldn't be confirmed. The drawer where she'd locked Luca's chip data had been pried open, metal bent at the corners. But the intruder had missed something. Lena had kept a backup copy of the scan in her personal bag, which she'd taken home the night before. She quickly retrieved it from her purse and slipped it into her pocket, just as the front doorbell chimed. Lena, you in here? It was Marissa, a part-time shelter employee. Oh my God! What happened? Call the police, Lena instructed, her voice steadier than she felt. But not Officer Tolliver. Anyone but him. Earlier that morning, Frank had driven back to the forest clearing where he'd found Luca. Something had been nagging at him, a sense that there was more to discover. The spot looked different in daylight. Frank noticed things he'd missed in the dim evening light. Fresh tire tracks cutting through the mud, cigarette butts scattered near a fallen log, and worst of all, a second cage partially hidden by brush about 50 yards from where Luca had been imprisoned. This cage looked newer, the metal less rusted. Frank knelt beside it, examining the ground. Dark stains spattered the leaves beneath. Blood, not old enough to have fully dried. Someone had been here recently. Frank took photos with his phone, his jaw clenched tight. This wasn't just about Luca or Amy anymore. Something systematic was happening in these woods. They knew exactly what they were looking for, Lena explained, pacing across Frank's living room. Luca watched her from his spot by the fireplace, ears perked forward. The only files touched were the ones related to abandoned fighting dogs I've been tracking. Frank showed her the photos from the forest. Found this today. Same area where I found Luca. Lena's face paled as she examined the images. This confirms it. The fighting ring is still active. What does Tolliver have to do with all this? Frank asked. Lena lowered her voice, though they were alone. I've been connecting dots. Tolliver has been first responder on at least 4 cases of abandoned fighting dogs. Each time, evidence disappeared. And, she hesitated, I found something else. 3 of the dogs, including Luca, were registered to families with children in the foster system. Frank's blood ran cold. Like Ella. Exactly. I think Tolliver's using his position to cover up the fighting ring, and possibly worse. These families disappear, their animals are used for fighting, and the children. She couldn't finish the sentence. We need proof, Frank said, his hands forming fists at his sides. Enough to keep Ella safe and put Tolliver away. Frank sat at his kitchen table, phone pressed to his ear, as the caseworker's voice crackled through the line. Mr. Delaney, I need to inform you that Ella is being transferred to a different foster placement, she said, her tone professional but tired. What? Why? Frank gripped the phone tighter. Luca perked up his ears from his spot near the door, sensing the tension. The current family has requested her removal. She's been, the caseworker paused, extremely distressed, crying constantly for her dog. They say she barely sleeps, keeps drawing pictures of a German shepherd, and asking when she can go home. Frank's heart squeezed in his chest. A little girl he'd never met was suffering, crying for the very dog now sitting in his living room. His granddaughter. Where are they taking her? His voice came out rough. I can't disclose that information at this time, Mr. Delaney, until paternity is established. Listen, Frank cut in, something fierce rising in him. That little girl is my granddaughter. Her mother was looking for me, and I have her dog, the dog she's crying for. He took a deep breath. I want to apply for custody. Today. There was silence on the other end. Then, you'll need legal representation, Mr. Delaney. I'll get it, right now. After hanging up, Frank didn't hesitate. He called the number Lena had given him for a family attorney named Sarah Michaels. The receptionist scheduled an emergency consultation for that afternoon. Frank gathered the box from Amy's storage unit, Ella's drawings, the letters, photos, and placed them carefully in his truck. Luca jumped in beside him as if knowing exactly where they were headed. That same evening, Lena sat in her car across from the Pinewood Diner parking lot. She'd followed Officer Tolliver's patrol car after her shift, keeping a safe distance. The officer had parked in the far corner of the lot under a broken streetlight. 20 minutes later, a black SUV pulled up beside him. Lena sank lower in her seat, her heart pounding. She raised her phone camera just as Tolliver stepped out to meet a heavy-set man in a leather jacket. Through her zoom lens, she could make out manila envelopes changing hands, followed by what looked like a thick stack of cash. The exchange took less than a minute. "Got you," she whispered, snapping several photos in quick succession. The images were grainy and distant, but they clearly showed Tolliver in uniform accepting something that definitely wasn't police business. It wasn't concrete proof of his involvement with the dogfighting or foster care corruption, but it was a start, evidence of a man who could be bought. Lena waited until both vehicles had driven away before starting her engine. Her hands shook slightly as she texted Frank. "We need to talk. I have something." Frank stood in the doorway of the shed, surveying the dusty space that had remained sealed for 5 years. Sunlight filtered through the small window, illuminating dancing dust particles. With a deep breath, he stepped inside, tools in hand. "Time to make some changes," he murmured to Luca, who sat attentively at the threshold. Over the next few days, Frank worked methodically. He cleared out cobwebs, swept away years of dust, and sorted through his daughter's old belongings. Some items he carefully packed away in labeled boxes. Others, a colorful wooden bookshelf, her favorite reading chair, he cleaned and restored. The physical labor felt good, purposeful. Each hammer stroke and brush of sandpaper seemed to chip away at the wall he'd built around his heart. Frank installed new shelving along one wall, painted it a soft blue, the color his daughter had always loved, and began arranging Ella's drawings from the storage box. A crayon picture of a little girl holding hands with a German shepherd, another showing 3 stick figures, a small one, a tall one, and a dog, standing beside what looked like a house. Frank's hands trembled as he pinned them up. Luca watched every move, rarely leaving Frank's side. When Frank stepped out to get supplies, the dog would pace anxiously by the door until his return. One afternoon, Frank found Luca whining softly at the gate when he came back from the hardware store. "Hey boy, I'm back," Frank said, kneeling to ruffle the dog's fur. "I wasn't gone that long." Luca pressed against him, tail wagging with relief. Frank realized then how deep their connection had grown. This wasn't just Amy's dog anymore. This was his companion, his link to a future he never expected. One evening, Frank discovered an old training manual among Amy's things. On a whim, he tried a command. "Luca, sit." The dog immediately sat, ears perked forward attentively. "Stay." Luca remained perfectly still. "Come." The dog bounded to Frank's side. Frank smiled, genuinely impressed. "You're something special, aren't you?" The next day, Lena's car pulled into Frank's driveway just after sunset. She glanced nervously over her shoulder before hurrying to the door. "I can't stay long," she said as Frank let her in. Luca greeted her with a gentle nudge of his nose. Lena pulled a small flash drive from her pocket. "Everything's on here. The photos I took at Tolliver's exchange, plus a voice memo detailing exactly what I saw, dates, times, location." Frank took the drive, feeling its weight beyond its physical size. "Keep it somewhere safe," Lena warned, her voice low. "If Tolliver finds out we have this—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Frank nodded, tucking the drive into his pocket. "I will." The phone's shrill ring cut through the quiet evening. Frank reached for it, his brow furrowing at the unfamiliar number. "Mr. Delaney?" A woman's voice trembled on the other end. "This is Mrs. Perkins, Ella's foster mother. I don't know who else to call. Ella's run away." Frank's heart dropped like a stone. "What? When?" "About an hour ago. We had a small argument about bedtime, and when I went to check on her, the window was open. We've looked everywhere nearby." Her voice cracked. "She mentioned you and that dog several times today." Frank was already grabbing his keys. "I'll find her. I'll call you when I do." Luca sensed the change immediately, standing alert as Frank rushed to the door. "Come on, boy. We need to find Ella." The night air bit cold against Frank's face as they drove to the foster home. Mrs. Perkins, a thin woman with worry-lined eyes, handed Frank a small stuffed animal. "This is hers. It might help your dog." Frank held it to Luca's nose. The German shepherd sniffed deeply, then turned toward the edge of the property, where a small patch of woods began. His ears perked forward. "Good boy," Frank whispered. "Find her." Luca moved with purpose, nose to the ground, weaving between trees. The beam of Frank's flashlight bounced across the uneven terrain as they ventured deeper into the forest. His heart hammered against his ribs. What if she was hurt? What if Tolliver had found her first? 20 minutes in, Luca suddenly barked, sharp, urgent sounds that echoed through the trees. He bolted forward, and Frank ran after him, branches whipping at his face. Ella! Frank called out. Ella! Luca disappeared beneath a fallen oak tree, his barking changing to soft whines. Frank dropped to his knees, shining the light into the hollow space beneath. There she was, a small figure curled into herself, tear-streaked face looking up with wide, frightened eyes. Ella Delgado, Amy's daughter, his granddaughter. Luca? Her voice was barely a whisper as the dog pressed against her, licking her face. It's okay, Frank said gently. You're safe now. Ella clutched Luca's fur, burying her face in his neck. I knew he'd find me. I knew he wouldn't forget me. Frank pulled out his phone with shaking hands and dialed emergency services. 911. What's your emergency? I've found a missing child in the woods off Pinecrest Road, Frank reported, giving their approximate location. As they waited, Ella kept her arms locked around Luca, her small body still trembling. I thought he'd forgotten me, she whispered to the dog. But you didn't. You came. Frank watched them, his throat tight with emotion. In that moment, he understood completely why Luca had been scratching at the shed, why he'd appeared in Frank's life. This was his purpose, to reunite what had been broken. The wail of sirens cut through the night as red and blue lights flickered through the trees. 2 paramedics rushed down the forest path, guided by Frank's flashlight. She's here, Frank called out, stepping back as they approached the fallen tree. A female paramedic crouched down. Hi there, sweetheart. I'm Tara. Can you come out so I can make sure you're okay? Ella clutched Luca tighter, her eyes wide with fear. The dog helps her, Frank explained. Maybe let him stay close? The paramedics exchanged glances but nodded. Slowly, Ella crawled out, never letting go of Luca's collar. As Tara checked Ella's vitals and wrapped a silver emergency blanket around her shoulders, a young officer approached Frank. Sir, I need to ask how you're connected to the child. Frank took a deep breath. She's my granddaughter. Her mother, Amy Delgado, passed away recently. I only just found out about Ella. Amy and I were together years ago, but I never knew she had my child. His voice cracked. I've been working with family services to establish custody. The officer studied Frank's face, then his expression softened. Wait, Delaney? Sergeant Frank Delaney? 3rd Battalion? Frank blinked in surprise. Yes. Sir, my older brother served with you. He told me stories about how you saved his unit. The officer straightened respectfully. I'll make sure my report reflects your relationship to Ella and your efforts to find her tonight. This should help with family services. Thank you, Frank said, genuinely moved. At the hospital, the emergency room staff tried to separate Ella from Luca for her examination. No! Ella screamed, her first loud outburst. Please don't take him. He keeps the bad dreams away. The attending social worker, Ms. Chen, watched as Ella trembled violently when Luca was led a few feet away. When the dog returned to her side, Ella immediately calmed, her breathing steadying as she stroked his fur. He's her emotional support animal, Frank explained quietly to Ms. Chen. They've been separated for weeks. He belonged to her mother. Ms. Chen made notes on her tablet. I can see the therapeutic benefit. This is significant documentation for your case, Mr. Delaney. The hospital door opened and Lena rushed in, looking breathless. Frank, I've got it. She pulled out her phone and showed him a video. The backup security system at the shelter caught this before it was disabled. On the screen, Officer Brent Tolliver clearly appeared, looking directly at the camera before reaching up to disconnect it. I've already sent this to my contact at the police department, Lena said. Tolliver can't wiggle out of this one. Ms. Chen leaned forward. May I see that? If Officer Tolliver has been involved in Ella's case at all, This could be relevant to our proceedings." As they huddled around the phone, Ella finally drifted to sleep on the hospital bed, one hand buried in Luca's fur, her face peaceful for the first time since Frank had found her. 3 days after the hospital incident, Frank paced nervously outside the county courthouse. His newly pressed shirt felt stiff against his skin, and his hands couldn't stop fidgeting with his tie. "It'll be okay," Lena reassured him, holding Luca's leash. The German shepherd sat calmly at her feet, freshly groomed and wearing a vest that read, "Emotional Support Animal." Frank nodded, unable to speak through his tight throat. This emergency custody hearing could change everything. Inside the courtroom, Ella sat with her temporary guardian, her small shoulders hunched forward. When she spotted Luca at the door, her face transformed. "Luca!" she cried out, starting to rise. The bailiff stepped forward, but Judge Martinez raised her hand. "Young lady, please remain seated," she said kindly. Then she looked at Frank and Luca. "Is this the support animal mentioned in the petition?" Frank's attorney stepped forward. "Yes, Your Honor. We have documentation showing Luca was certified as an emotional support animal for Ella's mother. The child has shown significant distress when separated from him." Judge Martinez studied Ella's brightening face. "I'll allow the animal to remain if he behaves appropriately." As Luca entered, he moved directly to Ella's side and sat beside her chair. The girl's hand immediately found his fur, and her breathing visibly steadied. Outside the courthouse, Lena had stepped away to take a phone call when a familiar figure approached her. "You should have minded your own business," Officer Tolliver hissed, backing her against a column. "Those videos won't hold up. I've got friends who can make evidence disappear." Lena stood her ground. "Back off, Tolliver. You're finished. You think you're so—" "Is there a problem here?" A uniformed officer approached, hand resting on his belt. "Officer Davis," Lena said with relief. "This man was just threatening me regarding evidence in an ongoing investigation." Officer Davis's eyes narrowed. "Tolliver, step away from the lady." "This is ridiculous," Tolliver sputtered. "She's lying." "I heard enough," Officer Davis said firmly, reaching for his handcuffs. "You're coming with me for questioning." Back in the courtroom, the judge reviewed the evidence while Ella sat quietly with Luca. "The court has examined Ms. Rivera's testimony regarding the connection between Officer Tolliver's activities and the disruption of proper foster placement," Judge Martinez stated. "Additionally, the documented emotional response of the child to both Mr. Delaney and the support animal presents compelling evidence for maintaining this relationship." She looked directly at Frank. "Mr. Delaney, this court grants you temporary custody of Ella Delgado while the investigation continues. You will work with family services on a transition plan and regular check-ins." Frank's eyes filled with tears as Ella looked up at him with the first hint of hope he'd seen on her face. "Thank you, Your Honor," he managed to say. The path to redemption he'd never dared hope for was finally opening before him. In the days following the custody hearing, Frank Delaney's quiet house suddenly felt different. Unfamiliar sounds filled the spaces, small footsteps, the occasional clatter of a glass being set down, the soft rustling of bedsheets in the spare room that was now Ella's. The 10-year-old girl moved like a shadow through the house, speaking only when necessary, her eyes always searching for Luca. Frank stood in the kitchen one morning, staring helplessly at the cereal boxes he'd bought. "Do you like any of these?" he asked awkwardly. Ella se encogió de hombros, sus dedos retorcidos en el pelaje de Luca. "Whatever's fine." Their conversations rarely went beyond these brief exchanges. Frank would try to ask about her day, and Ella would answer with 1 or 2 words before retreating to her room with Luca at her heels. It was Luca who began to change things. Whenever Ella isolated herself for too long, The German Shepherd would gently nudge her door open with his nose. He'd whine softly and tug at her sleeve, leading her toward the backyard where Frank spent his afternoons. In the shed, now transformed into a bright workshop, Frank was building what he called a community shelter. It was a wooden structure with multiple compartments designed for the local animal rescue. "It's for dogs like Luca," he explained one day when Ella followed the persistent canine out to watch him work. "So they have somewhere safe to wait for their forever homes." Ella nodded, sitting cross-legged in the doorway, watching Frank's hands move skillfully across the wood. Day by day, Luca continued his gentle insistence. When Frank would sand a piece of wood, Luca would nudge Ella closer until Frank handed her a small piece of sandpaper. When Frank measured boards, Luca would sit between them until Frank asked Ella to hold the tape measure. One evening, Frank came into the living room to find Ella sitting on the floor with the box from Amy's storage unit open beside her. She was reading one of her mother's letters, her small fingers tracing the handwriting. Luca lay protectively at her side. Frank hesitated in the doorway, unsure if he should intrude. "Did you love my mom?" Ella asked suddenly, looking up at him with eyes so much like Amy's. Frank's throat tightened. He crossed the room and carefully sat down on the floor across from her. "Yes," he said quietly, tears forming in his eyes. "I did. I just didn't know about you until it was too late." Ella studied his face for a long moment, then nodded, as if confirming something to herself. "She wrote about you," she said, holding up the letter. "She said you had kind hands that could fix anything broken." That night, Frank couldn't sleep. Ella's question about loving her mother had stirred something deep inside him, memories he'd buried beneath years of guilt and grief. In the darkness of his bedroom, Frank's mind drifted back to 8 years ago. He'd met Amy Delgado at a community fundraiser. She was vibrant and warm, with a laugh that seemed to chase away the shadows that had followed him since his daughter's death. For a few brief months, they'd found comfort in each other's company. But then the anniversary of his daughter's death had approached, and the walls had come crashing back down. Frank remembered the pain in Amy's eyes when he told her he couldn't continue their relationship. "I'm not ready," he'd said, his voice hollow. "I don't think I'll ever be ready again." Amy had reached for his hand one last time. "I understand," she'd whispered, though her eyes said otherwise. "Take care of yourself, Frank." He never saw her again. The next morning, Frank passed by Ella's room and paused. The door was slightly ajar, and he could hear her soft voice reading aloud to Luca, who lay attentively at her feet. "Dear Frank," Ella read from one of her mother's letters, "I found out I'm pregnant today. I wanted to call you, but I know you're still healing from losing your daughter. I don't want to interrupt your grieving process, but I hope someday you'll be ready to know about our child." Frank leaned against the wall, his heart pounding. He'd had no idea. All these years, Amy had been raising their daughter alone, trying to protect him from more pain. "I drive by your house sometimes," Ella continued reading, her voice steady beyond her years. "I see your truck in the driveway and wonder if today should be the day. But then I remember how broken you looked the last time we spoke, and I decide to wait a little longer." Luca's ears perked up, sensing Frank's presence. The dog's eyes met Frank's, filled with a knowing that seemed almost human. The truth sank into Frank's bones. He had missed his chance with Amy. But here was Ella, their daughter, giving him another opportunity to make things right. The low, threatening growl pulled Frank from a restless sleep. His eyes snapped open in the darkness, instantly alert. Midnight shadows filled the room, but Luca's silhouette was clear at the window, hackles raised, teeth bared. "What is it, boy?" Frank whispered, sliding out of bed. Luca growled again, his eyes fixed on something outside. Frank crept to the window and peered through the blinds. A dark figure moved stealthily across the yard, pausing occasionally to look toward the house. The moonlight caught something metallic in the person's hand. Frank's heart hammered against his ribs. This wasn't a random trespasser. This was deliberate. With shaking hands, he reached for his phone and called Lena. "Someone's outside my house," he whispered when she answered. "It's probably one of Tolliver's people." Lena's voice was tight with worry. "Frank, they're after the flash drive. Tolliver must be desperate. He knows that evidence could end him." "What should I do?" "Hide it somewhere they won't look. I'm calling the police, but they might not get there in time." Frank's eyes fell on Luca, still standing guard at the window. Making a split-second decision, he grabbed the flash drive from his nightstand drawer. He unclipped Luca's collar, carefully tucked the small device inside the padding, and fastened it back around the dog's neck. "Good boy," he whispered, patting Luca's side. A soft noise from the hallway made him turn. Ella stood in the doorway, her small frame silhouetted against the dim night light from the hall. "Frank?" Her voice trembled. "I heard noises." Frank crossed the room in 3 long strides and without hesitation wrapped his arms around her tiny shoulders. It was the first time he'd hugged her, really hugged her, since she'd come to live with him. She stiffened for just a moment before melting against him, her small hands clutching the back of his shirt. "You're safe? I promise," he whispered into her hair, surprised by how fiercely he meant it. This child, his child, would not face another loss, not while he had breath in his body. Luca padded over, pressing against both of them, forming a protective circle. As outside, the shadowy figure continued to prowl. Across town, Lena Rivera stood nervously in the precinct, clutching a small envelope. The station buzzed with activity, but she focused only on the door marked Lieutenant Nunez, Internal Affairs. Taking a deep breath, she knocked. "Come in," called a firm voice. Lieutenant Nunez was a serious woman with salt and pepper hair and eyes that missed nothing. She gestured for Lena to sit. "I have evidence," Lena said, sliding the envelope across the desk. "Officer Tolliver has been involved in illegal dogfighting rings and tampering with foster care placements. This is a copy of what he tried to steal from Frank Delaney's home last night." Nunez examined the contents, photos, voice recordings, and timestamps. Her expression hardened. "We've been building a case against Tolliver for months. This might be what we needed." She stood up. "Wait here." Within the hour, Tolliver was escorted into the station, badge and gun confiscated. "Officer Brent Tolliver, you're suspended pending a full investigation," Nunez announced as other officers watched. Lena exhaled for what felt like the first time in weeks. Meanwhile, Frank drove his truck down a quiet country road, Ella sitting silently beside him, Luca between them. The cemetery gates came into view, and Frank felt his chest tighten. "We're here," he said softly. The 3 walked together between rows of headstones until they reached a simple marker. Amy Delgado, beloved mother. Ella se arrodilló en el pasto, sus pequeños dedos trazando las letras del nombre de su madre. From her pocket, she pulled out Luca's original tag, the mysterious "I'm sorry" that had been on his collar when Frank found him. "Mom used to tell me that Luca was special," Ella whispered. "She said he would find you someday and bring us together." Tears filled Frank's eyes as Ella carefully placed the tag at the base of the headstone. Frank knelt beside her, placing his hand gently on her shoulder. "You don't have to carry that pain alone," he said, his voice breaking. "Your mom tried. I see that now. And I'll keep trying too." Ella leaned against him, and Luca pressed close to them both. His warm presence a comfort as they sat together in the quiet cemetery, beginning to heal. The next day, Frank and Ella invited Lena over for dinner. After they'd eaten, they sat on the porch, watching Luca play in the yard while Ella sketched in her notebook. "There's something I never told you," Lena said, her voice quiet. "This case with Tolliver, it's personal for me." Frank looked up, curious. "Back in the summer of 1965, my father was a local reporter," she continued, staring into her coffee mug. "He stumbled onto a dog-fighting ring operating in the county, the same area where we found Luca." Her hands trembled slightly. Dad gathered evidence, photos, names. But when he tried to publish his story, he was threatened. When he wouldn't back down, his brake lines were cut. Tears filled her eyes. "The police called it an accident, but I found his notes years later." Frank's face softened with understanding. "That's why you never gave up, even when they vandalized the shelter." Lena nodded. "Some of the same family names are still involved. Tolliver's uncle was mentioned in Dad's notes." Frank stared thoughtfully at the shed he'd been transforming. "You know, this place could be more than just my project. What if we made it official? A foundation for animal welfare education?" "What do you mean?" Lena asked. "Kids could visit, learn about responsible pet ownership, recognize signs of abuse." Frank's eyes brightened with purpose. "I could help fund it, use my skills to keep expanding the space." From the yard, Ella approached with her sketchbook. "Look what I made," she said shyly, showing them a colorful drawing. It was a sign with bright letters reading Luca's house, and a perfect dog paw print pressed into the corner with paint. "For the shelter," she explained, "so everyone knows who it belongs to." Frank and Lena exchanged glances, both moved by the simple gesture. "Luca's house," Frank repeated, putting his arm around Ella's shoulders. "Perfect name for a new beginning." The morning was bright and clear as Frank, Ella, and Luca set out for their daily walk. The trail behind the house had become their favorite routine since Ella had moved in. Now, Frank watched as Ella tossed a stick for Luca, who bounded after it with his usual enthusiasm. "He's getting faster," Frank commented, smiling at the pair. Suddenly, mid-stride, Luca let out a sharp yelp. His back legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed onto the dirt path. His body trembled as he tried to stand but couldn't. "Luca!" Ella screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. Frank's heart hammered in his chest as he rushed forward. "Don't move him," he said, his voice tight with fear. He gently placed his hands on Luca's quivering body. "We need to get him to the vet. Now!" Frank carefully lifted Luca, cradling him like a child. The dog whimpered softly against his chest. Ella ran ahead to open the truck door, tears streaming down her face. The drive to the vet was the longest 15 minutes of Frank's life. In the rearview mirror, he could see Ella whispering into Luca's ear, her small hands stroking his fur. At the clinic, the veterinarian quickly took Luca into the examination room. "It looks like an old injury that never healed properly," she explained after the initial assessment. "Likely from abuse. It's flared up and needs immediate surgery." As Luca was wheeled away, Ella pulled something from her pocket. The old photo of Luca with baby Ella that they'd found in Amy's storage unit. She stared at it, tracing Luca's image with her finger. "He found you because Mom told him to," she said quietly to Frank as they sat in the waiting room. "She knew he would bring us together." Frank couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. He simply nodded and held Ella's hand. 3 hours later, the vet emerged with a tired smile. "The surgery went well. Luca's a fighter. He's going to be okay." They followed her to the recovery area where Luca lay on a padded table, still groggy from anesthesia. At the sight of him, vulnerable yet alive, something broke inside Frank. Tears he'd held back for years spilled down his cheeks. He leaned over and gently kissed Luca's head. "Thank you," he whispered against Luca's fur. "Thank you for bringing her to me." Ella watched in awe, seeing for the first time the depth of Frank's heart fully exposed. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the clinic window, casting a warm glow over the recovery room. Frank Delaney blinked awake, his neck stiff from sleeping upright in the hard plastic chair. He looked down to find Ella curled up against him, her small hand still resting protectively on Luca's paw. The German shepherd's eyes were open, watching them both with quiet contentment. "Hey, buddy," Frank whispered, careful not to wake Ella. "Feeling better?" Luca's tail thumped weakly against the bedding. The vet had allowed them to stay overnight, seeing how neither Frank nor Ella would leave Luca's side. Later that morning, after the vet checked Luca's bandages and pronounced him on the mend, Frank dropped Ella off at school and headed to the family services office. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled Amy's letter from his jacket pocket. "This was in the storage unit," Frank explained to Ms. Winters, the caseworker. "Amy wrote it to me, but never sent it." Ms. Winters unfolded the paper carefully. Frank watched her eyes move across Amy's handwriting, words explaining how she'd tried to find him, how she'd wanted Ella to know her father, how she'd understood his grief. Frank also placed several of Ella's drawings on the desk, colorful pictures of Luca, Frank, and herself, standing in front of a house with a bright sun overhead. "She drew these since coming to stay with me," he said softly. Ms. Winters nodded, her expression softening. "These show real emotional connection, Mr. Delaney. I'll add them to your file." She closed the folder and looked at him directly. "The final custody hearing is scheduled for next week. Based on what I've seen, I'm feeling optimistic." Across town, Lena Rivera stood at the podium in the city council chamber, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "The evidence against Officer Tolliver points to years of corruption and animal cruelty," she stated, looking each council member in the eye. "I'm asking for a permanent investigation into the dogfighting ring and his involvement. These animals suffered. Families suffered. Justice is long overdue." The council members exchanged glances as Lena presented her documentation. Behind her, several community members nodded in support, including the high-ranking officer who had suspended Tolliver. For the first time in years, things were changing for the better. For Frank, for Ella, for Luca, and for the town that had harbored too many secrets for too long. The courthouse hallway felt unusually bright that Thursday afternoon. Frank stood motionless, barely breathing as the judge's words echoed in his mind. Full custody granted. After weeks of uncertainty, home visits, and testimony, it was finally over. Frank Delaney was officially Ella's guardian, her family. Ella, who had been sitting quietly beside her caseworker, suddenly broke free and ran down the hallway toward Frank. Her small feet barely touched the ground as she launched herself into his arms, tears streaming down her face. "We did it!" she cried, burying her face in his shoulder. "We're really staying together." Frank held her tightly, his own tears falling freely now. The walls he'd built around his heart had crumbled completely. He looked over Ella's shoulder to see Luca wearing his support animal vest, wagging his tail despite the bandages still wrapped around his midsection. "We're a family now," Frank whispered, his voice breaking. "All of us." That evening, as the sun began to set, Frank, Ella, and Luca gathered in the backyard. Frank had set up a small table with a framed photo of Amy Delgado, a picture he'd found in the storage unit. Ella carefully placed wildflowers around the frame, while Frank lit a single candle. "Your mom loved you very much," Frank said softly as they stood together. "She tried to bring us together, and in her own way, she finally did." Ella nodded, leaning against Frank's side. "Through Luca," she said. "Mom always said he was special." Luca, moving slowly but steadily, walked to the center of their small circle and sat down, his eyes reflecting the candlelight. The sound of a car door closing announced Lena's arrival. She walked through the gate carrying a small package. "Am I too late?" she asked. "Just in time," Frank replied, making room for her in their circle. Lena's eyes were bright with news. "It's official. Tolliver's been dismissed from the force. The DA is filing criminal charges based on the evidence we gathered." Frank nodded, relief washing over him. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." Lena smiled, then looked at the candle flickering in the evening breeze. "For Amy," she said softly. "For Amy," Frank and Ella echoed together as Luca let out a gentle whine of agreement. The summer sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink as a small crowd gathered outside the newly finished shelter. A hand-painted wooden sign hung above the entrance, the words "Luca's House," carefully decorated with colorful paw prints. Frank stood to the side, watching as people from town arrived, some with leashed dogs, others carrying cat carriers, and many families simply coming to show support. Lena moved through the crowd, greeting volunteers and explaining the shelter's mission to curious visitors. She caught Frank's eye and gave him a thumbs up. Ella stood on a small wooden crate at the entrance, wearing her favorite blue dress and clutching a piece of paper. Luca sat beside her, his coat gleaming in the evening light, a brand new collar with a shining gold tag around his neck. The tag read simply, "Messenger of Love." As the crowd quieted, Ella took a deep breath. Her voice, once so small and hesitant, rang out clear and strong. "Thank you all for coming to Luca's house," she began, glancing down at her dog with a smile. "This place is special because it's about second chances. Luca saved my heart when I was really sad. He found me when I was lost in the woods, and he helped me find my Grandpa Frank." She looked over at Frank, whose eyes were already glistening with tears. "And my Grandpa Frank saved my life by giving me a home and a family again. Together, we want to help other animals and people find each other, just like we did." Frank couldn't speak. His throat felt tight with emotion as he watched this brave little girl who had changed everything. Ella had blossomed from the silent, frightened child he'd first met into someone confident and full of joy. Lena handed Ella a pair of scissors tied with a red ribbon. Ella motioned for Frank to join her. He walked over, placing his hand gently on her shoulder. "Ready?" she whispered. Frank nodded, still unable to find words. Together, with Luca standing proudly between them, they cut the ribbon to Luca's house. The crowd applauded as the doors opened, welcoming everyone inside. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the windows of the shed, casting a warm glow on the polished workbench. Frank sat on a wooden stool, carefully wiping dust from a silver picture frame. Inside was a faded photograph of his daughter at age 8, her smile bright and carefree as she held up a small trophy from her school's science fair. With gentle hands, Frank placed the frame on a newly built shelf right beside a newer photo of Ella and Amy. The resemblance between his daughter and granddaughter was striking. The same determined set to their chins, the same spark in their eyes. "There," he whispered. "Together, at last." Frank pulled a sheet of paper from his pocket and smoothed it flat against the workbench. He picked up a pen and began to write. "Dear Sarah," the letter began, "it's been a long time since I've talked to you properly. I'm sorry for that. For a while I couldn't bear to face the world without you in it." His hand trembled slightly, but he continued, "I want you to know I found a way to live again. Not just exist, but really live. Your niece, Ella, she reminds me so much of you. And this dog, Luca, he somehow brought us together. I think maybe you had something to do with that." Frank paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. I'm not hiding from life anymore. I'm building something good. I hope you can see that, wherever you are." He signed the letter and folded it carefully, placing it in a small wooden box on the shelf beneath the photos. Luca, who had been watching quietly, moved to lie beneath the workbench, his eyes fixed on Frank with quiet understanding. The shed, once a tomb for painful memories, now hummed with purpose. Children's artwork decorated the walls. Volunteer schedules hung beside blueprints for outdoor kennels. What had been a shrine to grief had become a sanctuary of hope. Frank reached down to scratch behind Luca's ears. "Thank you," he whispered, a smile crossing his face. For the first time in years, the weight of the past felt lighter. He was finally at peace. The months passed, and Frank, Ella, and Luca became a familiar sight in town. Locals who once only knew Frank as the reclusive mechanic now waved as the trio walked down Main Street. Ella had settled into school, making friends and bringing home report cards that Frank proudly displayed on the refrigerator. Every weekend, she helped at the shelter, her gentle way with the animals drawing smiles from visitors. Luca had transformed too. No longer the frightened, malnourished dog from the forest, he walked with confidence beside Frank and Ella. Children at the shelter would gather around him, his patience seemingly endless as tiny hands patted his fur. "He never even flinches," a volunteer remarked one Saturday, watching Luca sit perfectly still while a toddler hugged him. Lena had expanded the shelter's mission, organizing weekly workshops where Frank reluctantly found himself as the main speaker. "I'm not good with words," he'd protested at first. "You're good with truth," Lena had replied. "That's what matters." Now he stood before groups of children and parents, sharing Luca's story and how compassion had rebuilt 3 broken lives. One sunny afternoon, a small boy with a pronounced limp approached the shelter entrance. Frank noticed him hanging back, watching Luca with longing eyes. "Would you like to pet him?" Frank asked gently. The boy nodded, stepping forward carefully on his braced leg. Luca, sensing something special, moved toward the child and sat perfectly still beside him. The boy's hand trembled as he reached out. Frank knelt down beside them both. "He's good with healing," he said softly. "Some hurts you can see, some you can't. Luca understands both kinds." The boy's face brightened as Luca leaned gently against his leg. At sunrise, Frank, Ella, and Luca walked through the pine forest trail where the rusted cage once stood. The morning light filtered through the branches, casting golden patterns on the forest floor. The air smelled fresh and clean, nothing like the day Frank had first found Luca abandoned and afraid. The spot where the cage had been was now cleared of debris and transformed. A simple wooden sign stood in its place, hand-carved by Frank himself. The words, "Compassion sets us free," were burned into the wood, each letter carefully etched as a permanent reminder. Ella stepped forward, a yellow ribbon clutched in her small hand. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail, her eyes clear and bright in the morning light. She reached up to tie the ribbon around the branch of a nearby pine tree, her movements deliberate and reverent. "Thank you, Luca," she whispered, her voice carrying softly through the quiet forest. "For not giving up on me. Or Grandpa." Luca sat beside her, his coat gleaming in the sunlight, healthy and strong. His intelligent eyes watched Ella with that same steadfast devotion that had never wavered, even in his darkest days. Frank knelt down beside Luca, his weathered hand resting on the dog's back. The lines in his face had softened over the months, the hard grief in his eyes replaced by something gentler, more alive. "I didn't rescue you," Frank said softly to Luca, scratching behind his ears. "You rescued me." The 3 of them sat together in the peaceful silence of the forest as sunlight broke through the trees in brilliant shafts. Birds called overhead, and a gentle breeze rustled the yellow ribbon. The moment felt hopeful and serene, a perfect contrast to the despair that had once filled this same space. In this quiet clearing, surrounded by tall pines and morning light, 3 once broken souls had found their way back to wholeness, together. If you enjoyed the story of Ella, Frank, Luca, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.